It's my delight to introduce the first of our three guest speakers, Massoud Shadjareh. Massoud is the chair of the Islamic Human Rights Commission, which is an independent campaign research and advocacy NGO based in London. It struggles for justice for all peoples, regardless of their racial, confessional, or political background. It was set up in 1997 as a non-profit with special consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. Massoud is an Iranian by birth and studied at Berkeley University in California. So I invite Massoud to unmute himself and share your presentation on From Gaza to Iran, the changing landscape in the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and my greeting to everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I mean, this webinar is very topical, very important, really, I'm delighted to be part of it. As Stephen said, I was born in Iran. I have been living in UK since 1970, and prior to that, I lived in United States in California for 4 years. Just to give you a picture of what Iran used to be, because when I was born 74 years ago in Tehran, the house that I was born in, we had a neighbor, a Jewish family as a neighbor, and I so grew up in that sort of environment. That wasn't really unusual for us Iranians, because there was a very sizable Jewish community and a very thriving Jewish community, and we didn't have that sort of separation. And I know this point has been made not just about Iran, but indeed the whole of the Middle East, and many people who have lived in Middle East, be it in Yemen or in Iraq or Jordan or anywhere else in the Middle East, have actually articulated this. But I think it's very important to say this, because there is nothing inherently a culture of anti-Semitism in Middle East. As a matter of fact, the sort of anti-Semitism was more of a European disease and a Western disease, which was, tried to be injected into the area. But having said that, Iran at the time of the revolution went through quite a fundamental change. It was really the first time in the region that a country which was so much part and parcel of US hegemony actually broke free and became an independent and stood against the sort of hegemony of US and its oppression and its colonial legacies and so forth and so on. And part of that was the complete change of attitude towards occupied territories and the state of Israel. And it's sort of going very quickly through it, the Israeli embassy was taken over and was handed over to the Palestinians and PLO at the time. And this was quite a fundamental change in Iran. And I think that was also part and parcel of bringing the wrath of the West against it. Then we had the Iraq War, which was instigated and supported not just by Arab nations, but United States and the whole world, was supporting. And Iran independently stood for 8 years on this against this imposed war. And it was victorious because it survived and it survived in totality of all its territories and became more confident and so forth, although it paid a very high price. But from then on, Iran has been part and parcel of supporting the Palestinians and standing against apartheid, standing against illegal occupation and the brutality of it. And again, I have to say that by doing so, it became a targeted community, a targeted nation. As we have all experienced, all of us, Muslim, Christians, Jews, people of all faith and none, whenever you make that commitment to stand in support of the Palestinians, no matter where you are, you could be living in the occupied territories, as many of you guys are very familiar to that, or you could be living in the West, or you could be living anywhere. The minute you do that, you become targeted. You become anti-Semite. You become a terrorist. You become demonized. And that demonization process is what is needed by the Zionist state to survive and create that fear, both for the opponent and also, I have to say, for its own supporters, because it needs to have that fear to mobilize and unite people against and make them ripe for accepting to do the unthinkable, to actually support genocide, to support killing, to support ethnic cleansing. And that fear is needed absolutely to do that. And also that fear is used for punishing anyone who dare to stand up. And we have seen this. We have seen Iran, which incidentally, the facts and figures shows very clearly, has never occupied any of territories of its neighbors. It has never attacked anyone else. It's becoming demonized to the extent that becomes the enemy number one of the whole world, and it sort of cannot function economically, sanctions, etc., demonization. Then carrying you through this from there on to here, then we had the accusation that Iran is trying to have an atomic bomb. And then we had the accusation of went through JCPOA process, which everyone who is able to think and use their brain knows that it was, JCPOA was indeed, if there was a sort of any assurances, any control internationally, it was there to ensure that the fears that was created by the fearmongers and the Zionists and the extreme right in United States and so forth will be addressed. And so, Iran on one side made those commitments and signed up, and on the other side, Ayatollah Khamenei, the late Ayatollah Khamenei, gave a fatwa saying that all the weapons of mass destruction, in particular the nuclear weapon, is unlawful from Islamic point of view, from a Shia Iranian sort of perspective, and so therefore it will not be going down that route. And as a matter of fact, if you go back to the 8 Years' War, this is based on what happened at the time Saddam was using chemical weapons. And part of the armed forces went to late Ayatollah Khomeini and said that, look, they're using chemical weapons. They're being very effective. And please allow us to go down the route of us arming ourselves with the chemical weapons. And he said, under no circumstances we could go for that sort of weapons of mass destruction and weapons of indiscriminate and so Iran, sort of with one hand tied behind their back, fought that war and did not go down the route of chemical weapons. Now, the demonization has been tremendous. It's been very effective. There are something in the region of 40 Iranian channels being sort of zoomed into Iran, television channels, and they try to demonize the present government in Iran, and against the human right, against every aspect of humanity. And then also the international media has been very effective, creating illusion that this is the worst abuser of human rights. This is the one that actually humanity need to be scared of, while we see that Zionist regime in Palestine, occupied Palestine, is committing genocide in front of our eyes. Look, there is no doubt that who has been killing indiscriminately ordinary people, ethnic cleansing, and committing genocide, which at least has killed 80,000 people, many of them women and children, and majority of them innocent, as is being defined under international law, and ethnic cleansing, leveling the ground. But that is not being sort of questioned in the international media. What illusion that has been created that in the riots in Iran prior to start of the war, they are talking about 30, even up to 40,000 people have been killed in matter of 4 or 5 days. Now, we know this is half of the people who were victims of genocide over 2 years, using aircraft, using tanks, using indiscriminate bombing, using the most sophisticated armed forces against people who have nothing to sort of protect themselves. And, how could you do half of that number of victims in matter of few days? And you haven't got a single photograph to show this. I mean, to kill that many people, you need to use such a force that is unbelievable. It is unbelievable. It will be such a destruction that it will be so visible, but there isn't. The numbers were around 3,000. And as a matter of fact, I myself happened to be there. I was visiting my daughter and my son-in-law at the time, and I was in Iran, not just in Tehran. I was traveling with them around. So I was actually, in those few days, I was in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Mashhad, and also in Yazd. And I could see what was going on. And as a matter of fact, overwhelming majority of people, ordinary people, were very fearful of not the government, not the security forces, but a small number of people who were well trained, well armed with the automatic weapons, and they were using Molotov cocktails and all sorts of weapons, very brutal. I mean, I saw the head of a security guy being chopped off and put on the top of the lights, red lights. And people were very fearful of that. And what in reality happened, the first few days, people were coming out, demonstrating because of the pressures of economy and the sanctions as a result of sanctions and so forth. And there was no problem. suddenly there was this injection. And we know this now very clearly, that both Netanyahu said very clearly that we were there next to and supporting shoulder to shoulder these rioters, and Trump has admitted that we were arming them. So what would any society do if a group of people come out in the midst of the demonstrators and start shooting and turning the thing into using automatic weapons and so forth? That definitely will be very brutal. That definitely will create challenges which would result in death of many innocent people, and it did in Iran. And I remember very clearly in Tehran when I was coming back from Mashhad, and I got there sort of around 8 o'clock, and I was going from the airport to where we were staying, and we went through one of these sort of groups of people. We were standing, shouting, and so forth and so on, and it was there was a sort of there was a conflict, but it wasn't. The minute that it became very difficult was when individuals came in and started shooting, and the people were becoming target. And when we got home, one of our neighbors came and said, "Could you please lock the door, front door?" And because these mad people, not security, these mad people are dangerous, and we need to protect ourselves. So what I want to tell you is that this creation of this illusion was there as a preempt to, as a part of the program to bring a change in the government in Iran. And then, Netanyahu managed to convince Trump, as he hasn't been able to convince any previous president, to take this stupid position of actually fighting and starting the war against Iran. Now, sorry, I want to just say something as a conclusion. Look, Iran has been preparing itself for this moment. After the 8-year war, when Iran couldn't even buy barbed wire to protect itself against Saddam Hussein and the brutality which was unleashed on it, decided that never again we are going to be left powerless to defend ourselves. And they knew very clearly that what the Zionist state stands for and the stance that Iran has got vis-a-vis illegal occupation, there's going to come a time which they actually have to defend themselves. And they prepared for that. And that preparation has been extremely well sort of implemented, to the fact that now, after 2 years of genocide, killing all these innocent people, the only one who has managed to stand up fully and answer and against this genocide has been Iran. And as many people, not in the region but everywhere else, they say that what the stance that Iran has taken should have been taken by many others. And indeed, if it did take by many others, then hopefully we wouldn't have needed a war, which is, any war is destructive. Any war is going to create victims. And but I have to say that while we saw Europeans going to Oval House, sitting, after being sort of like a little kids in front of a teacher and being scared of Trump, now Iran has shown that really this fear is non-founded, and you are able to even be a power like Iran, and you could stand against the bully, and we need to do so, and we need to support that. And what is at stake is not the freedom of Iran, is not the freedom of Palestinians, is not the freedom of Lebanese, it's actually the humanity. Because if we allow this sort of bullying, this sort of normalization of genocide to become acceptable, then we are all in trouble. And indeed, the humanity is in trouble. Thank you very much for your time.
Massoud, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to invite Jeff and Elham to comment if they wish on Massoud's presentation. But a quick two requests of you as a participant. Can you please turn off your video? It will greatly enhance the quality of the webinar. If you can please turn off your videos. And secondly, if you have questions for Massoud, please put them in the chat and Linda will present the questions when we come to that point. So please turn your videos off if you know how to do that. That would be great. Massoud, thank you. It's now my privilege to welcome Elham Fakhro to speak. Elham is the Research Fellow of the Belfer Center, Harvard Kennedy School. She previously held academic and teaching roles at Exeter University and New York University, Abu Dhabi, and acted as senior analyst for the Gulf states at the international. Sorry, I shouldn't be doing this. Forgive me. Elham and Jeff, please comment if you wish on Massoud's presentation. I got carried away.
No, that's all right. I can say a few words, sure. Massoud, thank you for that presentation. I think it was very comprehensive and we learned a lot. I suppose my only question really was looking forward, where do you see Iran kind of going after this? I mean, if you can tell us a little bit more about kind of your take on the future, if you're able to, that would be great.
Right. I think we are in a different ball game now after what happened in Iran, right after the war. Whatever happened, and there is a very likely, I think there is at least 60% likelihood that we will go into another sort of war before we see the end of it. But nevertheless, I think that fear factor of you can't challenge Israel, you can't challenge United States, and you need to beg them for some sort of solution. It is broken. I think Zionist state is not invisible any longer. People have seen how it's been attacked, and we need to move forward. The fear that one of the sort of illusion that has been created is that Iranians want to kill, all the Jews, and that sort of nonsense. And I think the reality is that if someone really studies the concept of even Ayatollah Khamenei's concept of what should be the solution for the occupied territories, is one of what could be only described as a democratic state. People who live there, they have to decide what sort of future they want, and there has to be an all-inclusive solution. And I think really this illusion of two-state solution, it's just not going to work. It will never work. It hasn't worked anywhere else. It wasn't possible to work in South Africa or anywhere else. And I think whatever we do, and I know I'm not naive. I do understand the obstacles for it, including the Palestinians who've been brutalized the way they have been brutalized. They don't want to sort of share the land, and this sort of fear has been created on both sides is going to make it very difficult. But I don't see any other solution for the region. But also, I think now, after whenever this war will come to an end, Iran is going to be in a much more powerful position, and it cannot be treated the way it has been treated. The unleashing of the war, economical war, going for 40 years, and sanctions and everything else. I think we're going to see a change over there because of the power of Strait of Hormuz.
Thank you, Massoud. Jeff, would you like to make any comments on Massoud's presentation?
No, I think it'd be good to go on with Elham, and then we'll come back after the three of us have spoken and all. I'll participate then. I think it'd be better.
Thank you, Jeff. Elham, I was halfway through your CV.
That's okay. I can just jump in with a quick summary. Basically, I'm an academic and an author is the summary. I've taught in various places, and most relevant to this, I've written a book on the Abraham Accords, which came out in late 2024 with Columbia University Press. And I'm also from Bahrain. So I'll jump right in. That's a good summary, I think. I'll talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords and how, really to get to the question maybe of have they lived up to their expectations or how is that really going now? Early on, I mean, the US administration especially was very keen to portray this as kind of the dawn of a new Middle East in 2020. The message we were getting was that the Arab states were lining up to normalize with Israel, that the Arab states and Arab publics no longer cared about the Palestinian issue, that there were more pressing questions to think about, primarily on Iran. And that the Arab publics, it was an older generation that cared about this, and the new generation doesn't care anymore. When it came to the US administration, I think with the Accords, what we saw was any diplomatic focus on resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was really kind of swept aside in favor of expanding normalization. And there was a bipartisan consensus, there still is, between the Democrats and Republicans, that this ought to be the focal point of US policy in the Middle East rather than dealing with this conflict as much of an imperfect broker that the US was. And I fully, acknowledge that. This was no longer really of interest at all, and the focus became deepening and expanding normalization. And I think this was done institutionally as well, even with Arab states that didn't sign on to the Abraham Accords. A small example is the US moving Israel into CENTCOM, which is the Middle East zone of command that all the other Arab states are in. And by doing so, the US, facilitated cooperation between Arab states and Israel in areas of security, including Arab states that are not party to the Accords, merely by having them in the same kind of unit. So even Arab states without ties to Israel, had to come to deal with it. The Abraham Accords altered the equation in some sense. In other ways, it did not. So I think crucially what happened with the Abraham Accords was the breaking of this formula for land for peace. So when Egypt normalized with Israel and Jordan normalized with Israel, this was done in exchange for the return of Sinai in Egypt's case. In Jordan, there was a finalization of land and water issues, so some sort of exchange. This time, when the UAE signed on, it was the first country to sign on after these. It was an exchange for really nothing at all. And I'm struck by an advisor to Netanyahu who referred to this as a cost-free peace. And I think that's absolutely right. It is a cost-free peace. And it created that expectation, I think, in Israel as well. And Netanyahu, for many years, had worked against the two-state solution, as we know, and had kind of made the argument that the Arab states will want to normalize with Israel eventually, out of its, strength and power. And even, most mainstream folks in Israel didn't take this seriously. But this is effectively materially what happened. And it did set a new precedent and a new expectation in Israel and in the United States that you could have this kind of cost-free peace that bypasses the Palestinians, and that the Arab states would be willing to do so. What did the UAE get out of this? I will quickly say it got a few things out of this. First of all, trade relations opened up. I think this was projected to get to $1 billion a year, which is significant for two economies of similar sizes. They are both third and fourth in the MENA region. For the UAE, I think an important component was normalization, bringing it closer not only to Israel, but to the United States and to the corridors of power in the US. And Arab states have long had the perception that building relations with Israel will actually get you closer to the US because you do want Israel to lobby on your behalf in Washington. And this is effectively one of the big reasons and one of the drivers, I think, is bringing having a partner on board in Washington in a way as well. After a year into the relationship, a year and a half-ish, we started to see security and arms transfers. Israel provided the UAE with arms, with certain anti-missile technology, as well as other types of technology, primarily in spyware and so on. Beyond that, the UAE, I think, sees Israel as a useful partner in the region. They're really aligned ideologically as well, I have to say, on several issues. Both states are anti-Islamist. I mean, they're anti-Islamist groups. They are pro-status quo. They're in favor of maintaining the longevity of these monarchies that keep the region and its people in check. Both have been against the Arab Spring, against the Iran nuclear deal. Their policies in Africa are also similar in some ways. They do support these kind of breakaway republics in some parts of Africa. So I think to me, it's more than a pragmatic relationship, which is what we saw with Egypt and Jordan. I think now it extends towards an ideological relationship, and that's the best way to understand this and to understand its resilience as well. I'll talk a bit about up to October 7th and how this has affected this type of normalization. After October 7th and with the Arab states seeing Israel's very brutal response in Gaza, there were talks between Saudi Arabia, with Saudi Arabia led by the Biden administration to join the Abraham Accords. However, Saudi has, perhaps to the surprise of some, remained committed to the Arab Peace Initiative. Its stance that normalization can only come with acceptance of a Palestinian state by Israel. This was tweaked, the language around this, to be an irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state. But Saudi has, to the surprise of some, remained committed to some kind of resolution of the issue. And it has shown that it will not take the UAE pathway, which is just giving up normalization for its own sake. Now, Arab publics, again, as a result of kind of the post-October 7th moment, have turned more and more against Israel. And this has also made normalization harder for these states, even though public opinion is not always the first thing that's taken into account, and sometimes is not taken into account at all. I've looked at there's been polling around this. 90% of Saudis opposed relations with Israel, over 60% and more supported a boycott of Israel across the Arab world. Even if you look within the UAE, within the first 3 years of normalization, a total of 3,000 Emirati nationals visited Israel, and the number for Bahrain was deemed to be too low to count by Israel's Ministry of Tourism. So even within these states, I would argue there's not much of an appetite, and it's a dwindling appetite, particularly after what we've seen with Gaza. Arab Gulf states are often thought to have no populations, or that these populations are fully co-opted, but that's not really the case. In a country like Bahrain, there's a very, very active civil society, and we still have several anti-normalization societies that are allowed to function and which do protest regularly against these agreements. And the government has allowed them to continue operating, I think, if only to just give people some breathing room. I think the Arab states themselves now see the Zionist project. They see this expansionism into Lebanon, into Syria, and the expansion of the destruction of Gaza, the Gaza model, into Lebanon and into other places. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that this expansionism is not only a threat to the Palestinians or the Lebanese or the region, but to the broader ecosystem of the Middle East. The bombing of Qatar was a very good example of Israel reaching as far as the Gulf, and really showing it this project of expansionism is being laid out very clearly for everybody to see, not to mention in the West Bank and so on. Now, Israel, I think, has also pushed the US into the war with Iran, and it has also put the Gulf states at risk there. There's a lot of talk about this now in the kind of Gulf-focused conversations, but there's definitely a certain betrayal that this country that was meant to be their main security guarantor, the United States, put them directly in the line of fire. And has effectively put Israel's interests first, because this war is, I don't believe, in anyone's interest but Israel, which pushed for it. And so Bahrain and the UAE remain committed to the accords. I think, as I mentioned, the UAE has some kind of ideological commitment to this. It sees itself as post-Arab. It sees its interests as aligned with Israel in the Middle East. And I think there's almost nothing Israel could do to change this perception in the UAE. However, I have two concluding thoughts. I think that the expansion of normalization in the region is really on pause for a long time. I don't want to say it's dead, but I don't think we're going to see the expansion of these accords. No Arab government will do so, I believe, after Gaza, and with Israel behaving in such a belligerent way. Populist sentiments against Israel are higher than ever. And I think it's clear that Israel will never be a normal partner in the sense of the term. It will always put its own interests in occupation and expansionism first. And the UAE, I think, could have seen clearly that Israel took the region to war knowing that the UAE would be hit, but that didn't matter. But that's the kind of partnership that Israel would have with states in the region, one where it comes first. But I think we can talk about the Abraham Accords a lot, but I'm struck by also what's happening outside the Middle East and outside these accords entirely, which I actually think is more important and which will shape the future of these agreements, which is the issues that Israel are facing in the United States and in Europe. As of, I looked at some figures recently. As of April 2026, the EU itself is under pressure from certain member states like Spain, Ireland, and Slovenia to suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which regulates trade and diplomatic cooperation due to its actions in Gaza and the West Bank. The Financial Times published an article last week called "Why America is Falling Out of Love with Israel," citing a Pew poll whereby 60% of Americans now view Israel unfavorably. And the younger they are, the higher that number. 3/4 of 18 to 29-year-olds sympathize more with the Palestinians and the Israelis in the United States. And that's an extraordinary shift for a country that was always basically pro-Israel. More and more people associate it with this heavy-handed militarism. The other trend is against Israel is among Democrats. 40 out of 47 Democrat senators last week voted to block U.S. arms sales to Israel, which is extraordinary. And a few years ago, Democrats would eagerly get money from AIPAC, but Democrats are now pledging not to accept this kind of money. More and more of them are. And of course, the trend is the same and prevalent with many American Jews. 61% say Israel is committing war crimes, and so on. Plus, when we look at international law, there's the ICC indictment, of Netanyahu and Gallant, which some Nordic nations are also pledging to enforce. Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Norway are all pledging to enforce this warrant. And we see this in the cultural space as well, with a very much contested Israeli presence in a competition like Eurovision, the European song competition. And I think I was listening this morning to Jeffrey Sachs actually making the same argument exactly, saying that I've never seen America turn so much against Israel. And while this will take time to kind of move into the policy space, he was making the argument that it is irreversible and he doesn't think it can change. And this is, of course, the result of its actions in Gaza and in the entire region and now with Iran and Lebanon. So I think I wanted to speak about the Abraham Accords, but I think while speaking about them, I'm also conscious that they're not the most important feature that will determine the future of the region or Israel or its relationship with its neighbors. I think what's happening in the United States is more important, even though, we were sold a vision that, Israel is going to normalize with all of its neighbors and everybody's lining up to do so. That vision proved incorrect. The Arab states, I think, in the region did show much more support for the Palestinians or even for their own interests than may have been perceived. They're not just lining up to follow in the footsteps of the UAE and Bahrain. Israel has damaged its own reputation through its own actions. And I think more so than in the region, the consequences of this globally are going to be apparent more and more in the coming years. That's it.
Stephen?
Thank you, Elham, for that very challenging presentation. If you have questions for Elham, please put them in the chat. Just a few of you are still showing your video. Please turn it off. And I'd like to invite Massoud and Jeff, if you wish to make any comments or ask questions of Elham, please do so.
I'll
Massoud?
take my position that I'll do that after the three of us speak.
Okay. Massoud, do you have any comments for Elham? You need to unmute yourself.
No, I find it extremely enlightening and enjoyed every second of it.
Thank you, Massoud. Thank you, Elham. We come to our third and final speaker today, Jeff Halper, director of ICAHD. Jeff co-founded ICAHD in 1997 along with other critical Israeli Jews. ICAHD focuses for the mobilization, its focus is the demolition of Palestinian homes Strapline is resisting apartheid and constructing a shared democracy in historic Palestine. Jeff was born and brought up in Minnesota and lives in Jerusalem today. He's an anthropologist, author, activist, twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, most recently in 2025. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. And no, I think the discussion has really gone really well so far. Both the presentations, of course, but also the concept of looking at Iran, which is obviously centered to what's going on today, and then the larger Middle East picture that Elham presented so well. And now I'd like to kind of stick in the Israeli part of it, in which there is a different emphasis. I am going to talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords that I think take on more of a significance when you come from the Israeli point of view than maybe it does regionally and even internationally. And I'd like to show some slides, as is my wont. If I can do that, I think I can because I'm a co-host. Let me know if this is working. Can you see the slides?
We can see.
Okay, great. So basically Israel, in my view, has no interest in the Middle East at all. I mean, its back is toward the Middle East. That's where its walls are. That's where its military is. And it's facing Europe. I mean, Elham mentioned the Eurovision. Israel's in the European Basketball Federation. It's in the European Football Federation. It sees itself as a part of Europe and in many ways kind of part of the United States. There's a joke. Why doesn't Israel want to be the 51st state? Because then it would only have 2 senators. So think about that for a sec. So that it really belongs, somehow by some fluke, it ended up in the Middle East, but it has nothing in common with the Middle East. Israelis don't know anything about the external politics of the region and who runs the countries and why is the Saudi Arabian policy different from UAE or nothing about that is in the Israeli news or interests Israelis or whatsoever. But it is in the Middle East, of course, and it's a violent settler colonial enterprise. Zionism, in order to, the very purpose of Zionism was to Judaize Palestine, to come in, take over the country of the Palestinians, take their land, displace them, replace them with Jews, and then normalize. And this is where I think the Abraham Accords and things around that, and Iran and Hezbollah and the Palestinians come into the picture. It's very violent, and so in a sense, Israel has accomplished the first phase of settler colonialism, which is the Judaization part, the settlement part. It has conquered all of historic Palestine. It's settled all of historic Palestine. And this map in front of you is the map from the Israeli Ministry of Defense that shows where Israel is going. In other words, not only is there no 2 states, which Israel has completely repudiated, even years ago. So Israel then expands on to about 90% of Palestine, but this isn't even Oslo with areas A and B and C. This is the Palestinians left in the West Bank who are confined to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little islands, mainly around the major urban areas. So it's obvious that either Palestinians are going to have to try to squeeze into these little tiny enclaves and make a kind of a Bantustan, and that would be the Palestinian entity, because Israel will not allow a state. It calls it, whatever the Palestinians will get will be an autonomous entity, which means for Israel, and Netanyahu has said this, he phrased it well, autonomy plus independence minus, somewhere in that kind of a space. But obviously, the 3 million Palestinians of the West Bank couldn't fit into this area, not to mention the refugees coming back. And so this is really a plan that's going to necessitate a violent expulsion of Palestinians if it's ever going to be. Now, it might not get this extreme, but at the same time, Trump's plan, a second if I can, Trump's plan is really is really no different, basically. And this is the plan that Trump presented in 2020 in the context of the Abraham Accords, because, of course, if there's normalization is the point of the Abraham Accords, I mean, you have to normalize with something. And so there has to be some Israeli-Palestinian resolution. And this was Trump's idea. That is still, I think, vaguely the idea, although there's been a lot of settlement and a lot of expulsion since 2020. But you see here, this is kind of the best scenario, where the Palestinians would have maybe instead of 8 or 9 or 10%, they'd have 15% of historic Palestine, but still in small, disconnected, and non-viable, non-sovereign enclaves. So that according to even the best plan, which is Trump's, and the plan most likely to go through, if in fact normalization goes through in some way, there'll be no territorial continuity for Palestinians, no sovereignty, no economic viability, and of course, no return of the refugees. So this is really all these plans that are sold as two-state approaches. And here's where Europe and the United States and even the rest of the international community, I mean, the BRICS countries, have also kind of supported this. Don't forget India, is a great supporter of Israel. Modi was in Israel a week before the invasion of Iran. China is very close to Israel for all kinds of reasons. And I wrote a book about that called War Against the People, why Israel is able to keep all these relationships. And so, in fact, this isn't only an American-sponsored plan. This is a plan that would not raise a lot of objections internationally. And as Elham said, because the Arab world is tending to go, not the people, but the governments, towards a plan in which, they're willing to normalize without the Palestinians, it could very well be that if there's because what Saudi Arabia is talking about is a pathway towards a possible two-state thing. So it doesn't have to be all worked out before negotiation. So you could get to a situation where the Palestinians are sold out, normalization or de facto normalization goes ahead, and then the Palestinians are just stuck in that limbo forever. And then beyond that, you have the idea of normalization that really is getting very close. Here's Netanyahu in the UN 2 weeks before the October 7th attack, which could explain part of the timing of the October 7th attack. And here he's showing the new Middle East. Here in the General Assembly, you can see the map of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia was on the cusp of signing, which I think explains partly why Hamas attacked in order to frustrate that. But at the same time, take a look at what Israel is. There is no Palestine on that map whatsoever. So Israel has no compunction. It has no hesitation in public of presenting these kinds of plans. They aren't secret. So this is in many ways the picture of where Israel sees this going. So there's three kinds of circles here that are important. What's important is before normalization, you have to have pacification. You had the Judaization of Palestine, but there's still resistance, meaningful resistance coming from within Palestine, coming from within the Arab world a little bit, but mainly Iran, as Massoud has said, and from elements like Hezbollah and the Houthis and a few others. So that you can't have normalization before pacification, because normalization is normalization. It's normal. And if you still have resistance, then you can't pretend it's normal, you see? And so I think this is the demand of in a way, or the expectation, if not the demand, of the Arab governments and the international community towards Israel. You have to create an industrial quiet that will allow us at some point to, even giving lip service to the Palestinians, then begin the process of normalization. And so what you're having is I think that explains Gaza. because the Israeli attack on Gaza after October 7th was one of genocide. I mean, it was, Gaza, Hamas, the Islamic Jihad represented the last bastions of effective resistance in Palestine. So pacification means you had to break that resistance altogether, and the Gazification of the West Bank followed that. Military attacks on Hamas and even Fatah positions, resistance positions in the northern refugee camps of the West Bank. So that's that circle. But beyond that, then you still have to pacify other sources of resistance, Iran at the head of it. And so the Israeli attack on Iran, I don't think Trump knows why he attacked Iran, but the Israeli, I think, purpose is very, very clear. And that is to break Iran as a meaningful rival for any kind of military hegemony in the Middle East, or any kind of a force that could keep the Palestinian issue alive, by the force of resistance and support. And I think Iran became, in a sense, another Gaza with the same purpose of breaking Iran as a support, a meaningful support for the Palestinians, and the same with Hezbollah. You're seeing the Gazification of Beirut today and southern Lebanon and so on. So you've got that circle. And then beyond that, you have the whole circle of the rest of the Middle East. And here Israel, I think, is making gains with Arab governments, not because, they like Israel or whatever, but because Israel has that military clout. It supports these repressive regimes with their spyware, as has been mentioned, with their surveillance technologies of repression, plus the fact that they're the only military force that can seemingly, and this has maybe been changing now with the Iran war, could seemingly kind of protect, the countries of the region against Iran, although they're paying a price, and I think there's second thoughts about how good Israel and the U.S. are for that. So I'll end on this, and that is, if you look at this map, you see the darker greens are countries in the Middle East that have already normalized with Israel. The lighter green countries, including Oman, Saudi Arabia, the Kurds, I think, are an element in here too. Syria as well are countries. I mean, Elham said, I think appropriately, not all these countries might join the Abraham Accords. And Saudi Arabia is kind of holding out to a degree, but that doesn't matter to Israel. It's the de facto joining, the de facto normalization. As long as we have some trade, as long as we have military stuff, the other interests that Elham has mentioned, especially with the UAE, that does have relations, it's good enough. I think it's good enough, kind of a good enough Abraham Accords. And that's where I think you'll see Saudi Arabia come in, the Kurds. Now, what's interesting is Lebanon. Now, you got the Brown, which are kind of in the process of formalizing a kind of normalization with Israel. Lebanon, if their military strength can be broken. And then even Iran. And here, Massoud, I want to hear what you say when we get to that. Because, of course, Israel surrounded Iran. Pakistan, who's behind the picture there, has also wanted to normalize with Israel for a long time. So that's in line. And Iran. And I think with Iran, I don't think they'll give up their position of supporting Palestinians. I think Massoud is correct that Iran has its own interests, its own ideologies, its own pride, its national pride, its independence. But I think a condition, and this is what I'm hearing between the lines in Iran, is if you want to end the sanctions and rejoin the international community, you're going to have to be, and the word that Trump uses is Israel friendly. You don't have to join the Abraham Accords, but you've got to be Israel friendly. You can't continue to support the proxies and have, militant Jerusalem days and, all that kind of stuff. So I think I would put Iran and the same with Syria, in a sense. I think Syria has gotten into a thing. Syria has negotiations with Israel. And that is the same thing. They're not going to join the Abraham Accords, probably, but nevertheless, they'll become Israel friendly. So if you look at the Abraham Accords from the point of view of an actual agreement that many Arab and Muslim countries have joined, or just a de facto framework, this is the problem. That normalization, I think, is going ahead for all kinds of reasons. And this is the greatest threat to the Palestinians since the Nakba. Because after normalization, there is no more political space. Normalization is normalization. It's not negotiations. It's a closure. The Palestinians aren't a part of that process, and they have no leverage, and there's nothing to negotiate after normalization. And that's where I think this process of normalization really has to be at the forefront of what we're looking at. And I think then that explains Israel's motivations in going after Iran, Hezbollah, Gaza, the Palestinians of the West Bank, and so on. End of slides.
Jeff, thank you so much for that very clear and thought-provoking presentation. Elham and Massoud, would you like to comment on Jeff's presentation or ask him a question? You need to unmute yourself if you do.
Massoud, please go ahead. Yeah.
Massoud, you've unmuted yourself.
No, I really, I think one of the things, if I may sort of ask a question, what we are noticing, those of us who live in Europe and, nationally and internationally, there is carrot and a stick, or what I would prefer to call it, the Zionists and the Israelis are basically becoming gatekeepers. If you want to have a relationship, even in Britain, with our own government, we have to get a stamp of approval from the Zionists. Otherwise, we become untouchables. And internationally, also, this is the case, as it was said before, that Arab states wanted to have access to power and to legitimacy and so forth. So they needed this to go through the gatekeeper. But I want to ask both of our colleagues, to what extent do you think the sort of the war, the 40 days war, has actually broken that? If not with just the government, but the people are actually saying for first time that it is possible to challenge the bully. And the minute you challenge the bully, then the bully cannot operate any longer. And I think we are seeing that, and we are seeing both internationally and also, as it was explained, in United States and in Europe, people are actually challenging. People actually have woken up. There is a tremendous awakening. I remember at the time of Vietnam War, I was in California and in Berkeley. It took a very, very, very long time for people to start supporting and standing against the US. But this is happening almost from day one. It's unpopular from day one. Majority of people in the United States, over 60%, are against this war, and in Europe and so forth, majority of people are against the state of Israel. Israel has actually lost the popular contest and is a bully which has been exposed. To what extent do you think that is going to bring a change in near future in Middle East and beyond?
Jeff, would you like to respond to that, or Elham?
No, go ahead, Jeff. I'll just jump in and say that, no, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I definitely share the view with you that this de facto type of normalization, or at least being Israel friendly, is certainly what's being pushed now. And I share your assessment of the threat, but I'll leave it to you to answer Massoud's question, and no further questions from me.
All right, just, well, really briefly, I agree that Israel is very vulnerable. I mean, Israel has really lost not only the public opinion, but in a way there was a real with this whole thing of the Holocaust and the weaponizing anti-Semitism and Jews as the ultimate victims and so on. There was a wall in which you couldn't criticize Israel. Elham mentioned the fact that even probably a year or two ago, Democrats would not have ever voted the way they did. You couldn't criticize it. It was anti-Semitic. Well, this was the whole point of the of this redefinition of the the Holocaust statement. That the criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, which a lot of governments and universities and others have joined in on. So that broke, I think, and that opened floodgates. So I think Israel really is losing it and I think that's trickling up into governments as well. The problem is, all right, where do you go from there? There is no, and this is really the issue. The Palestinians have very little leverage. They have very little political space because the degree of suppression that Israel and the Palestinian Authority, I mean, it has two sources of collaborative repression, is such the Palestinians simply can't even meet, let alone come behind a political plan, let alone organize politically, articulate their needs, articulate their visions, be a part of the political process. And so, in the absence of that, until I think this is part of the struggle, until the international community gives the Palestinians that political space, that protective space, in which they can come together and become a political actor and get their views into the ring. I mean, you can sanction Israel, you can punish Israel, but you're left with the two-state solution. And then even the idea of the two-state solution is going to be a Trump, which is really apartheid. So the worst that can happen to Israel without, releasing the Palestinians as a political actor is a two-state solution, is a two-state apartheid in which Israel's on 85% of Palestine, and the Palestinians are on 15%, and you call that two states, you see? So that's, I think, the problem. The only way that the vulnerabilities of Israel can meaningfully be exploited is if there's an alternative political program that brings Palestinian rights into the equation. And that, I think, is what's missing today. And without that, Israel can lose and lose and lose, but it can't. It's still going to win, because of a lack of somewhere else to go that at least the peoples, if not the governments, begin to adopt and advocate for.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to our three guest speakers. I'm going to hand over to Linda now to open up some discussion based on the questions in the chat. Linda, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. There's several questions in the chat line, and I'm going to try to focus on some of the bigger picture questions as we've got such wonderful speakers here today. So I'd like to start with, are the Gulf states questioning their alliances and the U.S. bases in the light of the pummeling they experienced during the war and the U.S. and that the U.S. offered no protection? Elham, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I can take that one. Yes, I think they certainly are. It's been obvious that the billions of dollars spent on U.S. weapons systems and hosting the U.S. and having many of these bases and a non-stop stream of weapons has done nothing to protect the Gulf states. There's more than that. I think the U.S. shuffled out many of its anti-drone or technical systems out to help Israel, offering few in the Gulf during this time. So, I mean, I think there should be a recalibration, and there is conversation around that. I'm, not very optimistic, because I think what you may end up seeing is maybe two things. One, I think several states will double down on this relationship, mostly because they are so beholden to U.S. interests by now. They just don't really know where else to turn or don't want to turn elsewhere. They remain committed to this. Their view of the U.S. is still that it's the only party that can protect them and that will protect them. And so I think you're going to see it doubling down and more arms spent, more money spent on this relationship rather than the logical kind of alternative. But on the other hand, you may see some other states try to diversify the relationship. Saudi Arabia has done this a little bit with having a defense agreement with Pakistan. It's moving a little bit closer to Turkey and Egypt and so on. So I think you may see some of that diversification, but fundamentally, I don't think the U.S. relationship or this kind of dependency on the U.S. is really going anywhere, despite the very clear lessons of this war. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of Turkey, how normal is Turkey with Israel when they spit back so much, threatening military actions? It's interesting that Jeff says Israel doesn't care about the Middle East, yet this map shows seemingly a lot of interest in the Middle East. So, Jeff, do you want to start with that and unmute and answer it?
Well, I mean, Israel cares about the Middle East only in terms of itself. I mean, it's a me-centered caring. I mean, it cares about the Middle East from the point of view of again, eliminating all forms of resistance, of normalizing, of coming into the role of a military hegemon. And I think this is what's putting it on a collision course with Turkey, because I think there could be here a real competition over military hegemony. Yeah, I don't think Turkey wants to give up its its influence in the Middle East to Israel, certainly. And then, of course, sales of weaponry and technologies and technologies of repression to the Arab world. And then beyond that, as Elham said, there's also different kinds of interests in supporting different conflicts here and there, especially in Africa, and so that there are overlapping interests. So for all those reasons, Israel, relates to the Middle East, but it doesn't care from the point of view of integrating to the Middle East. And that's why I'm saying normalization doesn't matter to Israel. It really doesn't care if tourists go to Bahrain or if, we go have corporations go have dinners in Riyadh or something. It doesn't care about integrating into the region. It's a part of Europe. All it cares about is normalization, basically. And from that point of view, I think the Arab world also has to look at its interests. And if I can take the opportunity, Linda, to ask Elham a question, is that possible?
Yes.
What I wanted to ask that gets a little bit into the more global thing is that some of the Arab states like Egypt, and Iran as well. So Massoud, this is part of Iran, Egypt, I think the UAE, have joined the BRICS, and Saudi Arabia has been invited in and hasn't really decided which way it's going. The BRICS are supposed to be the global South alternative to NATO and the global North and so on. So I guess my question to you is there any possibility of, especially seeing how the United States and Israel haven't protected the Gulf states, is there any possibility that they would begin to shift towards BRICS? And even though BRICS is friendly to Israel, nevertheless, that creates some space between the United States and Europe and the Arab world and BRICS in terms of Israel, and maybe begins to create a new dynamic. Do you see anything in that?
I think that's a great question. Thanks, Jeff. I think BRICS kind of comes secondary to the US relationship for the UAE, even for Saudi Arabia. I think especially the UAE, they see themselves as operating at kind of the first tier, which is US, Israel. Those are the relationships they want. They'll seek and they'll do what they need to do to maintain. The BRICS comes, I think, at a second tier, whereby it's useful to have diversified global alliances, and they do this with India too. They've been, developing much closer ties to India and other parts of the globe. But these are kind of as a second tier supplement, if you will. They're not intended to replace the US, and I don't think they see them as important. And if they ever had to choose, I think they choose their kind of top tier partners. And even that's kind of the relationship with China too. They kind of want Chinese tech when the US is not willing to sell them that tech. But when the US is willing to do so, they're not going to go to China. I think that's how they see it.
Good, thank you. I'd like to ask Massoud a question from one that's in the chat line, please. You represent a human rights organization, and there's a question about how the panelists feel about international law, given that it is so liberally flaunted by Israel and their supporters, who act with total impunity and with no consequences whatsoever. Would you speak to that, Massoud, please?
Yes. Well, in reality, what we have witnessed over the last 2 years, from the time of genocide started, sort of international law have become sort of completely irrelevant, and international community, not just international courts, but UN, etc., all these institutions, including OIC and everything else, are really have been totally irrelevant and incompetent to even save the life of one child in Gaza. And as a matter of fact, they've been undermined by United States and by Israel, and indeed Europeans and the rest of the world have more or less abandoned it. I think brings the thing that how can we actually go back to some sort of future which is not going down the route that is going right now. At the moment, we are going down the route of normalization of genocide and genocidal act as a norm to decide and to define international relations. And this is extremely dangerous, because if they could get away in Gaza and in Lebanon and elsewhere in Syria and so forth and so on, then it will not be just the Zionist state of Israel which will be using these tools. Others could use it. I can imagine sort of a flashpoint in India, for example. We are seeing the rise of Hindu nationalism brutally, and if that happens in India, it will be catastrophe in much, much greater sort of scale. So I think, what I'm trying to say is that we are at the crossroad. Either international community pulls back these abusers, like State of Israel, and the support, by silence at least, of these genocide, or we are sleepwalking into that direction as the future of humanity. And which way we will go, it very much depends how things turn out. And I think the situation in Iran is important. What would happen in the next few months, and does Iran manage to be victorious by surviving? And if it does it become a much more powerful player or not? And then also international community, ordinary people, the awakening that we are seeing in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere, and indeed in the Arab world, and the awakening that we are seeing even in places like Turkey and even Saudi Arabia, that they feel they've been abandoned. They feel that if there is no Iran, they will be next on the target of arrogance of the Zionist state and so forth. Would that make a change or a sort of a push for a change? But the way it's going at the moment, really, I mean, we are seeing the special rapporteurs are being sanctioned. We are seeing judges of international court are being sanctioned. They can't even have their own bank account in their own country. So what hope is there for just saying there is a international law?
Very good. I'll just ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn back to Stephen. Can the panelists address the role of China? Jeff mentioned a friendly relationship with China, which I don't think is necessarily shared by many others. Jeff, do you want to kick off with that? And then if Elham and Massoud also want to say something about China and how they see the role of China right now.
Well, the expectation of China as kind of the leader of the global South in the BRICS bloc was that, of course, what the global South has wanted all since, independence, freedom from colonization, is to enter into the international economic and political order. The new international economic order program, the Third World Project of the 1960s and 70s. So in a way, it's a continuation of that. And then there was an expectation of something ideological, that there would be some global South, liberatory, progressive, maybe more inclusive of the peoples of the world, a more diverse voice, a more empowering voice that would come out of the BRICS blocs as they began to build alternative institutions, economic institutions, political, the alliances begin to grow and so on. And that has really not happened. The BRICS has basically become a kind of a state capitalist. It's not an alternative to the global North. They want into the global North. I think that's the main agenda today. And so you don't have the expectation we had that it would somehow be an alternative. And so China has no ideological problem with Israel whatsoever. I mean, it's and not only that, of course, but Israel has very strong economic ties, very strong military ties with China, both in terms of surveillance. Israel's very involved with the Uyghur surveillance. Israel's been involved with the repression in Tibet and other parts of China and so on. And and it has very strong relation. China is now rebuilding the port in Haifa. That's very upsetting the Americans, because American warships are going to be docking in a Chinese-built port. Who knows how many wiretapping things are going to be within the infrastructure. China's building the subway system in Tel Aviv. So this whole idea that somehow China is a force that could a progressive force that would go against Israel, would support the Palestinians. I mean, it is supportive of the Palestinians, but not in a symbolic way, not in a way that's going to really. They're not going to step out. It's like I sort of said before, in a way. I don't think Palestine is an important enough issue to disrupt the international system and the economic flow and the military flows and everything else. To be taken that seriously. So it'll be brought up. Maybe China at some point will prohibit the Ministry of Defense's apartheid system and accept Trump's apartheid system or something like that. But I don't think it's going to go beyond that.
Good. Thanks, Jeff. I think, Stephen, if you'd like to now go to the next part. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And thank you to everyone who asked a question, and our apologies to those who did not have your question asked. Thank you. I'd just like to invite our three speakers to summarize their presentations in literally a couple of minutes. Massoud, would you like to reiterate your presentation in just a few sentences? What's the main point you want to get across?
Well, I mean, we just gone through 40 days of war in Iran, and it was started on the assumption that it's going to be something for just few days, everything will collapse if you actually target the leadership and and they did, and they were successful in eliminating layers of leadership. That will mean end of Iran, and then there is no obstacle whatsoever, and the people would rise up. But it actually gone exactly opposite. I mean, the fact of the matter is that now the world actually sees that this was a failure. It was a total failure. Iran is more powerful now than it was at the beginning of the thing, not just because of the Hormuz, but because of the fact that it survived, is still able to sort of head back. And more importantly, and I think this is something that I want to emphasize here, the popularity of Iranian government right now, it's at all-time high. It's something that I haven't seen since the revolution. People of all different backgrounds, all different sort of variation of religiosity and so forth and so on, are coming out every night, and they're still doing it. I mean, I talk to friends and so forth every night. They're still going out. They were going out when they were being bombed and so forth. And there is a tremendous spirit. And I think that is what's going to win the day. And that's going to be inspiration to many people in the region. And that will be probably the most important fact of defeat for Zionist state and hegemony, US hegemony.
Massoud, thank you. Elham, your final thoughts, please.
Sure. Well, I'll just summarize what I said. I explained the Abraham Accords and kind of why they happened, the technology, strategic, military interests, and so on. These don't really represent the people of the region, I don't believe. While these agreements are not expanding, the states that signed up are, in some sense, doubling down on the relationship, and I think they've chosen their path quite clearly. It's just very obvious that some states are really choosing to kind of support the US imperial Zionist sort of pathway. And it's extraordinary, I think, to also see that just be made so clear. It wasn't as clear when I was writing the book, and now it's just more and more evident the more time goes on. I really enjoyed Jeff's points on de facto normalization. I think that's the case now. This order, this imperial order, wants the states, at least if you're not going to fully normalized, then you should at least not be hostile to Israel. I think that's why states like Syria that are kind of run by a former, Islamist leader are allowed to kind of function because he's taken that stand of not exactly being not hostile to Israel. Reading the region is important along with global trends. I've mentioned much about the kind of movement against Israel globally, which I think is much more significant than what's happening in the region. And it may seem paradoxical because this is kind of coming up alongside an equal effort to repress these movements on college campuses with the IHRA definition of the Holocaust. But I think this shows us how effective this is becoming, and that the challenge to Israel's actions and behavior and US behavior in some places is not going to go away that easily. Yeah.
Jeff.
Well, I had, I guess, 2 points that I'd like to just emphasize at the end. One is that, that Israel is vulnerable, of course. But again, that's not going to go anywhere unless, the Palestinians can be empowered to come in with their own agenda and their own plans and their own views into the political process that normalization does not allow. Because again, normalization is not a negotiation, it's an imposition by states on what's going to happen. So I think the first thing that we have to do, if we want to exploit Israeli vulnerabilities and the support that the Palestinians do have in the region and internationally, is again to begin to empower Palestinians by giving them a protective space, a political space, and so on, to try to encourage that. And the second thing is that the Palestinians, are not only a people that have a progressive background, you know, and they're very committed to democracy and to the liberatory struggle and so on, but they are a part of the Arab world. And Zionism is kind of the last continuation in some ways of the European colonization of the Middle East. And I would look forward to a time when the Palestinians are able to assume the political role that they should have, that I think they would begin to be a catalyst for progressive forces all over the Middle East. I know Elham and Massoud might think this is very naive and Pollyannish and so on, but I would really look. I think that the real struggle that still is unfinished here is the struggle against colonialism, and to bring the Middle East back into, you know, get out of these European states that are dysfunctional and get back to a more fluid, almost Ottoman type of a Middle East. And I think the Palestinians could play a great role in that, especially if we get beyond the divisiveness and the militarism introduced by Zionism and Israel into the region. So I think there's visions that are dependent on, and processes dependent on, ending this issue, you know, of Israel.
Jeff, thank you. On behalf of everyone participating today, I want to thank Massoud, Elham, and Jeff for their very thought-provoking presentations. And it's been such a delight to be part of this webinar. I'd like to hand back to Linda.
Thank you. You know, again, there was so much in the chat line and we didn't get to, but perhaps from now on, we always talk about West Asia, coming away from, you know, the colonial definition of the Middle East. That'd be one of the starting points. Malcolm, could you please bring up some slides? I'm ending by going over some announcements for us. There was a lot in the chat line about, you know, the future of Israel, Palestine, one democratic state, or, you know, equality, democracy, all of that. I would encourage you to connect with ICAHD, because that is something that we address regularly, and especially through Jeff's books. We've got chapters not only in the UK, the US, Germany, and of course, Jerusalem. And we send out publications, but, you know, we've got a fantastic website full of all kinds of resources, important resources, maps, articles. Jeff does monthly video updates from on the ground, monthly demolition and displacement reports. So we have all of that. ICAHD USA sends out weekly reports. ICAHD UK sends out monthly bulletins and newsletters. Our next slide just shows some of the topics that we've done just in the last month. So we guide people on actions. We have lots of analysis, recordings, and future events, which I will move on to next. We'd like you to mark your diaries, please, for Friday, the 1st of May, when Jeff Halper is going to be in a discussion with Sami Awad, who's the co-director of Nonviolence International. And the theme of that is solidarity in the face of genocide. And then ICAHD UK's next webinar is on the 14th of May, Thursday, and the theme is life and displacement in East Jerusalem. Fakhri Abu Diab is going to describe the 2 times his house was demolished violently, traumatically. So he will give his personal story. He's a real spokesman for the whole of Silwan and East Jerusalem. And then Munir Marjaya is going to talk about the other wider issues of displacement, the settler activity, the other demolitions, just how communities can come together and resist it, how they're trying to empower communities. So for these webinars, you can register them by going onto the website, and it's very clear from there. ICAHD UK will be back out on the streets for the next National March for Palestine, the 16th of May, when Nakba 78 is going to be commemorated. We march with our flags. We bring people together. We hand out our generic leaflets. And it's an opportunity to make new friends, come and join other like-minded people. We are in such a hard, painful struggle. So getting together with others really helps to empower us, keep us strong, gives us vision, and we march together. So do come and join us. And then the last slide here is about the ICAHD issue-based study tours that we offer. The next one is in November. We have a lot of information about it on the website, but these tours are grounded in ICAHD analysis. We have more than 30 encounters. We have daily debriefing sessions, which are really powerful as well, just like when we are with our hosts. Our hosts consist of Palestinians and critical Israelis, like Jeff, and some others who oppose their government. We're based in Bethlehem, and then we end up in Nazareth. So if you'd like to come to Palestine, Palestinians need us there. They need our solidarity at this time when, as we've heard tonight, again, governments are still not on their side, not bringing this to any just conclusion at all. We are needed, so come. It's so powerful. That's the last slide. And so it is now for me to also thank our tremendous speakers. What a privilege to hear from them. Thank you, Stephen, too, for leading us through. And thank everybody for coming. We want to see you again. We'd love to see you again. Write to us the questions that weren't addressed, you really want answered. Send them in, and then we will get back to you. So thank you. See you soon, and goodbye.